Good morning, everyone. Good morning, my lovely friend Anahita. And again, I cannot thank you enough for getting up at like 5:30 in the morning to join us on this call. Um, Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the mummies. We'll start with a quick introduction of Anahita herself. Anahita is a beautiful postpartum doula. She has done extensive training in sleep coaching, and she will tell us a little bit about her approach in her introduction, and then we'll dive right in and talk about all the issues that we might encounter with our little ones.
Thanks, Johanna. Good morning, everyone. It is 6 in the morning because I decided to travel. So I'm glad that my alarm went off and I'm here. So yes, I am a postpartum doula and a holistic sleep coach by training. I'm trained through the holistic sleep coaching program in the UK. This is a open college network level 6 program, so it's very extensive and detailed and very evidence-based. My approach is really just to sort of take a very holistic view around sleep. It's not all about sort of like fixing how a child is sleeping, but really looking at all the factors that impact and contribute to sleep and how it develops over those sort of first few years of childhood. I, of course, do work with slightly older children as well. But the main thing is, I am very much in favor of attachment and responsive sleep strategies. So none of the strategies I'll ever suggest involve leaving a child alone without a response from a parent. So that's really kind of like what my approach is. So the thing is that when you hear about gentle sleep coaches, it's not always attachment based. And so that's what I like to highlight, that I'm definitely an attachment based sleep coach. And I'm very passionate about building and preserving attachment for caregivers and their children.
Amazing. And I really think that you're the only one who offers this approach. Ultimately, whatever it says on the label, most sleep coaches here in Singapore will actually be using the cry it out method at some stage. And there's obviously a lot of complications and side effects with that as well. Not judging anyone. This is as a doula, and Anahita is the same way. We're not judging people for what parenting choices they make, because ultimately it needs to work for you. What I find what I like about your approach is that it is so tailor-made, and you take into account different cultural practices. We have an amazing, beautifully diverse community with Bumpwise, and we all come from different backgrounds where we have very different approaches to sleep, right? So I think it's taking that into account as well. And absolutely, every situation is different with, who you have living in the house with you, or are you shift worker, or whatever, it might be in anything. And that's what a holistic sleep coach actually looks at. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that we've had people join, and as I said earlier, we have a diverse group of people on the call today: pregnant moms, newly postpartum moms, people with older kids as well. And I want to start with pregnancy, or rather with the newborn phase, because I really think that this is the crux for most people. Breastfeeding is okay, recovery is okay, but the sleepless nights, my God, they really take it out of you, right? So it's all about learning what is normal. And so I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. What is normal? What are we to expect in the newborn phase? And how can we set ourselves up to minimize sleep disruption or to work with very little sleep?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually pretty interesting, right? That as new parents, we're hardly ever given any solid understanding in terms of what to expect in that early newborn phase with sleep. I mean, we all know about the sleepless nights, but until you sort of really experience it, you don't truly understand what that's about, right? And I think, and it is hard. No one's sort of saying that it's easy, and I think that's why people don't like to talk about it. Either they blank it out, or they don't want to scare new parents. But the fact of the matter is that it is a transient phase, right? That newborn phase where babies are waking very frequently around the clock is something that, we're doing for maybe that early infancy period of our child's life. And then, of course, it does settle. But in terms of newborn sleep, what I find fascinating is that newborns are designed to sleep that way, right? It's an evolutionary protection for them so that they don't slip into very deep sleeps, so that they keep waking up and feeding, because that's so important for their survival, right? So we know that they're doing exactly what they need to do. What we need to understand, and often I'll speak to parents in the newborn period, is that everybody's up at night, right? So it's all about like, wait, how do I maximize the rest that I'm getting despite how my baby's sleeping? So, calling in your support systems, tag teaming with your partners, getting those people in, even in the daytime, who, all your friends who are like, oh, I love babies. Can I come in and cuddle with your baby? Like, sure, here's the schedule, be here Friday so I can get some rest. So it's really about structuring your support system. You don't have to do it alone. We were never designed to do it alone. And so whether it's professional support or friends or family, if you have family close by, really sort of tapping into that is great. Developmentally, newborns go through a lot of shifts in their sleep, in those sort of first 3 to 4 months. Initially, they're spending a lot of time in light, active sleep. And that's something new parents are not always aware of, is that sometimes they even look awake. It's this, what we call rapid eye movement sleep, where they're like making funny faces, they're moving around. Sometimes they do the exorcist eyes, as I call them, like, just showing you the whites of their eyes. And they're not like 100% awake. So, I always tell parents, like, wait, watch, let's see. Are they just transitioning a sleep cycle? Are they just moving around? We don't have to jump in immediately, but they do actually spend almost 70% of their time asleep in REM sleep. So it's important for us to understand that they are probably going to wake up every sleep cycle and need our support. The shift that happens around that sort of 3 to 6 month mark, or what is often known as the fourth month sleep progression, is really a huge progression in how they sleep. And then that sort of sleep architecture shifts. So they're actually spending more time in deeper sleep, which is great. But while that shift is happening, of course, you will experience some disruption. The good news is that about 6 weeks to 8 weeks or so, most babies are developing a circadian rhythm because they're born completely without one. And then you tend to see some shifts in night sleep, where they're actually doing more consolidated periods at night, or they're getting back to sleep easier at night just because their body's helping them out with that.
Okay. And I want to ask a question here, because in the newborn period, it is super important to understand that actually sleep goes hand in hand with feeding, and therefore also milk production and getting this show on the road, right? So it's really important to understand that it is not normal for a baby to sleep 6 hours. And often what you see at the hospital, or what people are told, is to swaddle the baby, to have it really, really warm. And then that baby is so sleepy that they can't get out of their sleep and show us those early feeding signs. And that often is where it goes, it's a slippery slope to not being stimulated enough, the baby not getting enough, the baby falling behind in weight gain, and all of these things. And sometimes jaundice comes in the mix as well. So it is important to note that a baby does need to wake up every 3 hours minimum. And when do we expect that to shift?
Right. I mean, absolutely, right. We have all of these modern day, like, for example, a lot of people use what is known as the snoo. I don't know if everyone's heard of it. It's this bassinet that basically rocks, shushes, like, it's amazing. But a lot of sleep consultants and lactation consultants don't love it. Lactation consultants, because it's lulling babies into sleep much longer than they need to or would be if they weren't in that bassinet. And of course, sleep consultants, because eventually you got to get out of that, right? So it's not always easy. But yeah, absolutely. Like, we want babies to be waking up frequently, especially in those first 2 to 3 months. A lot of babies will start consolidating at night, especially once they've regained their birth weight. Feeding is going really well in the daytime, especially. They just don't need to take in as many calories at night. I know that sort of there are different camps in the IBCLC world on this, in terms of like, do you wake them, do you not? But typically, once they cross their birth weight, if they have plenty of diaper output in the daytime, then we'll say, they can sleep 4 to 5 hour stretches. That's totally fine if they're getting there by themselves without a lot of help, right? Yeah. So I think it's always best to check in with a lactation consultant or your pediatrician based on kind of like how's your baby doing, how's their weight gain been. But usually by 6 to 8 weeks, I'll see a lot of babies consolidating nights, and that's a very normal developmental pattern so that they may not need that many feeds. But what you mentioned is absolutely true, that sleep and feeding is very deeply intertwined in those first few months. So getting that feeding going, you'll see a lot of babies cluster feeding in the evening. That's almost like their own way of stocking up on calories before they go down for a longer period at night. So getting feeding going is probably like my number one tip when it comes to sleep in the early days. Like that is, what we tend to focus on, not on the sleep bit. I do want to point out here that a lot of parents are worried about creating bad habits when it comes to feeding to sleep. And it's really something that I like to talk about because it's so worrying, because when you put your baby on the breast, there's all these hormonal interactions and even the hormonal content of your breast milk, which is designed to induce sleep. And then if you're like fighting it, it makes it really hard for you as parents. So I always talk about the fact that, look, I mean, it's your superpower. If you're breastfeeding, of course, then use that to your advantage. As long as they've had a good full feed, let them be there. Let them fall asleep at the breast. That's totally fine.
Yeah, amazing. And when is a baby actually ready to learn any routine? Or, because a lot of people think they're sleep training their child in at 2 months and so on. When are they actually able to learn anything? And can you talk a little bit also, because I think that is linked, about sleep hygiene versus sleep training?
Yeah. So, in terms of like developmental stuff, for example, for me, I often tend to wait until babies are 6 months before using any kind of sleep strategies to work on, a sleep plan or any kind of sleep interventions. And the reason for that is that we have so much research that tells us about how this synchrony is developing between mother and baby. Yes, a lot of that research is focused on the mother baby synchrony, but I don't like to get in there and mess all that up, right? Because we're learning about each other at that time. But sleep physiology is something that we can work on, which is what you mentioned as sleep hygiene. Ultimately, sleep is a physiological system of the human body, and there are things we can do to ensure that those sleep systems are working well and working in our favor. And that is what we call sleep hygiene, right? So things like waking up at a pretty consistent time in the morning, getting lots of daylight in the day, making sure the night is dark. Then, about 6 to 8 weeks, we'll often suggest starting to have a bedtime routine. These are all considered sort of sleep hygiene interventions, which don't involve separating out mothers and babies. And that is definitely something that we can work on pretty early on, right? That's not something that we have to wait until they're 6 months to do. And most parents are doing this in any case, but having those few sort of like really clear cues to the sleep system can be very helpful in their development.
Amazing. Okay, we have close to 40 mummies and daddies on the call. So I do want to make sure, I want to say it again because you might not have heard it earlier. We are super happy for you to ask us questions. So please feel free to let us know if there's anything you want to discuss with Anahita. And otherwise, we'll just continue talking because there's always a lot of information to be had. And my next question would be, what are our thoughts and the most recent or evidence-based research on co-sleeping?
I'm glad you asked me that. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that we know that sort of co-sleeping and bed sharing are slightly different, right? Like co-sleeping could include having your baby in the room with you. And we know now that even in the US, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending keeping your baby in your room for almost a year at least. And that's a big shift because earlier that was 6 months, but the evidence is conclusive that room sharing is a number one sort of protection for your baby in that first year from things like SIDS, for example. So having your baby in your own room at least 6 months, that's the minimum requirement by most sort of pediatric associations, but up to a year even. On bed sharing, the thing with bed sharing is the reason it's been kind of villainized a lot in the West, I'll say that because, of course, in Asia, it's a very normal practice. We see this happening everywhere, is largely because people were bed sharing unintentionally, accidentally falling asleep on loungers and couches and things like that. Whereas if we practice bed sharing very intentionally, following the sort of safe bed sharing guidelines, it is a very, very safe, if not protective practice for babies. If you look at countries like Japan, where almost some 60% of parents are bed sharing, they actually have some of the lowest rates of SIDS in the world. But those parents are protectively, intentionally bed sharing. They have very high rates of breastfeeding, so that's another protective factor. Most parents are sleeping on firmer mattresses with minimal bedding. So those kind of practices can really help in terms of that bed sharing. So I know that bed sharing is not for everyone. It's not like I'll pop in there and say, oh, why don't you just bed share? But we know that to preserve sleep for parents, bed sharing can be a game changer, right? Your baby's right there. And of course, we always recommend a breastfeeding parent if you're bed sharing, but you have your baby right next to you. They wake up. Before you're even awake, you've, side lie fed them, just sort of pop the breast in their mouth. They're back to sleep. You're back to sleep. Everyone's getting the most amount of sleep. And in fact, the anthropologist James McKenna, he had a word for it called breast sleeping. And he said that that's how human babies were designed to sleep, just like if you saw any mammal, they would never be sleeping separated from their baby until their baby's weaned. So it's really interesting to look at that and dive into the history of it, because really, until about 200 odd years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, everyone was bed sharing. Sorry.
And then obviously this encourages that the mom's sleep cycle adapts to the baby's, and therefore she will not be pulled out of her deepest sleep when the baby wakes up, and therefore it will be more restorative in a way, is what I've read. I don't know if you can concur with that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting some emergency call from my daughter, so I'm just
deal with that. I have some questions here in the chat. So we have a mom asking what your thoughts on pacifiers are and how to get rid of a pacifier if a baby is very attached to them.
Yeah, I mean, look, pacifiers it's a very personal thing. There is some research about like pacifiers and oh, sorry. Um,
Do you need
sorry. I just need a minute. It's fine. Just
Yeah, no worries at all. So I don't know. My thoughts on pacifiers is that, and this is just a personal, I'm not presenting any evidence-based research. If you can avoid it, do. If you do use them, try and get to a situation where you can get rid of them quite early on, because the more attached they become to them, the harder it is to get rid of them. So for two of my babies, I got rid of them before the first year, and that was really quite helpful. They had their first cold, they were spitting them out anyway, and then in the morning they were gone, and they were still accepting of that. Whereas my eldest, she was like 3 years, and it was really, really tough to separate her from the pacifier. And she says to this date, she's 31, that she's traumatized by the way we got rid of her. And we cut them up and put them in the trash. So maybe don't do that. But yeah, I think it's all about changing different habits and maybe finding a different way of them being able to self-soothe. So do you have
I mean, pacifiers, there is some research in the first year that they can be a protective factor against SIDS. Like, so if you introduce one, the general recommendation is not to take it away too early, but the jury is still out on that. Personally, I feel like if pacifiers make your life easy, just it's fine. Most dentists will recommend trying to take it away before the age of 2 or 3. It's much easier to take it away when they're older because they can understand. You can do a little, like, I don't know, pacifier burial ceremony or something like that. But I think that if the concern is in terms of it being a sleep crutch, I always feel like, okay, yes, there's a period where you will be the person putting the pacifier back in the mouth. But if you can just get through that period, they become quite independent and they can find it themselves. So then it's, not a bad thing to be able to just say like, oh, okay, here's my pacifier, and they get back to sleep without needing your support. So I'm not entirely like against them. Pacifiers, thumb sucking, they're great, they're very regulating, they can help with sleep. So why do we need to fight them?
Exactly. In fact, there are babies like our preemie babies, often in the NICU, they will be given a pacifier intentionally because it helps them develop their oral muscles to an extent where they can get better at sucking and being able to transfer milk from the breast into the bottle. So it's not always bad, but you know how life is now. It's always these extremes. Some are firm, supporters and other. Sorry, guys, if someone has themselves on unmuted, is that because you want to ask a question? Okay. What is your take on a white noise machine? Are these useful for newborns?
Yes, white noise machines are great. I think they can be very annoying for parents, right? Like sometimes if we're room sharing, for example, we usually recommend keeping them on at 50 decibels or less, so not super loud. I also like things like just a fan, right? A fan generates a sound that, well, actually a spectrum of sound called pink noise, along with things like nature sounds. Those can be really soothing as well. But yeah, absolutely. If white noise helps, again, like white noise, why not use it?
Okay. A question on transitioning a 15-month-old baby to a cot for naps rather than contact naps. The baby is exclusively breastfed.
Yeah. At 15 months, I'm not sure if I'd really bother. Like, I would just go straight to a floor bed. If that baby has never slept in a cot, it's very unlikely that they're going to like that experience because a cot feels very closed off for them, right? So then to start introducing a cot at that age, it's really hard. I would often say, like, why not just, if you had bought a cot, just take the mattress out of the cot and put it on the floor and see how they do with that. And the better thing about that is that if you're feeding them to sleep, then you don't have to worry about picking them up, putting them inside the cot. You can just feed them and move away, and then they're just sleeping where they were.
Okay. Sorry, I've lost
I
track.
think there is one question is, what is your view on sleep training?
Okay, yeah.
Sleep training is a very sort of wide word. It depends on what kind of sleep training, right? If you're talking about the more traditional kind of cry it out sleep training, I prefer not to share views. I just don't do that. I don't use that in my practice simply because I don't see enough conclusive evidence that it isn't going to impact the baby. So the jury is still out on that, right? And also, these are slightly outdated practices. Ferber was putting forward his thoughts in the 80s and 90s, the guy who came up with sleep training. I haven't seen any super updated version of it. This is now almost 40 years ago. So we need to see something that's more current that tells us that it's all okay. But I don't personally use those methods in my practice. Do they work and work quickly? Anecdotally, yes, I've seen that, but I haven't seen enough evidence to tell us what the long-term impact of those strategies are. So, yeah, I try to sort of stay away from any kind of unresponsive sleep training methods, but ultimately, I also don't love that word training, right? Like it feels very militant, sleep training. So I always say sleep coaching instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, 50 years is a long time, and we have a lot more evidence or a lot more research now on brain development and how, that can affect, and how the responsiveness and the attachment with the parent is just really, really important. Okay, we have a question on swaddling with fresh temperatures versus sleeping bags, like the Love to Dream, or leaving baby completely without any of these sleeping bags and devices.
I mean, look, I think swaddling and all of that is okay in those first few months. I think it does help them, especially with that startle reflex. So, some swaddling, I would say maybe you're swaddling at night or something like that to see if you can get longer stretches. But I don't know, Johanna. I know that swaddling is see, for me, like culturally, in India, we swaddled a lot. So again, I'm not commenting on swaddling. Sleeping bags are fine because I think most babies are not gonna keep warm with, we
Yeah.
don't want to put a blanket on them. So a sleeping bag is a nice, safe alternative. The
Yeah.
arms are out, there is plenty of space around the hips, so they
Yeah. Your Wi-Fi is getting a bit patchy.
become part of your sleep routines. It can be a cue to them that it's time to fall asleep. So I'm okay with sleeping bags. It's saying that my internet connection is stable. Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me okay?
It's a little bit unstable. It was just earlier. I will offer my perspective. Because I do see babies being swaddled in the newborn phase, and I do see that they're often not waking up for their feeds, and they're not showing us the signs, the early feeding signs, and that can be troublesome because by the time they wake up and they're crying, it's very different to get a good latch out of them and things like that. And so we need to be careful of not overheating. So there are new guidelines being developed in Europe that are not advise that are advising not to swaddle a baby, and the reason is that reflex, that startle reflex that Anahita was mentioning, is actually also a protective mechanism to get them out of their deep sleep and to be able to show you the signs that they need to feed. So that is really important, but obviously you do what works for you. And we'll move on because we have lots of questions. Thank you so much. We love having your individual questions here. When and how to skip breastfeeding through the night. My 6-month-old only goes back to sleep after breastfeeding and then waking up 2 to 6 times a night. So that's a lot of wake times. How
Yeah.
to maybe take the nap without rocking and breast? Sorry, that's the separate question.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, of course, we want to normalize night feeding. We have a lot of data that tells us that, a lot of babies are waking up at night and having night feeds. But of course, if that's 6 times, it doesn't feel very sustainable, right? That essentially means that your baby's kind of just loving going to sleep that one way, feeding to sleep, and then they need that cue every single time they're transitioning a sleep cycle at night. So what we often will suggest is doing what we call habit stacking, which means that while you're feeding them, you stack on some other cues that the baby could learn to sort of be comforted by. And then you start having more of a diversity in how they fall asleep using those other cues sometimes, breastfeeding sometimes. So at least you're setting yourself up with like a toolkit of ways that your baby can go to sleep so they're not only feeding to sleep. And that way, another caregiver can step in. So you can tag team at night. So another person goes to baby when they wake up. You are getting a slightly longer stretch of sleep. So having that diversity in how babies fall asleep is important so that they're not only falling asleep one way. Because what often happens is like you do something, they get to sleep pretty easily. You're like, wow, like this is my magic sort of combination. And then you're stuck kind of doing that every time they wake up at night. So yeah, it's really about sort of introducing lots of different kind of sleep cues and then using those to also get your baby to sleep. But of course, if you wanted a more sort of step-by-step approach, that's a lot of what we work on when we do a sleep coaching sort of strategy or plan, is to really look at your baby, what is their schedule like, and then talk about how they're sleeping and whether that feels sustainable for you.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that also answers the second question. So I'm moving on to my 4-month-old seems to prefer to feed during the night rather than during the day. Is this normal? This mom is exclusively breastfeeding.
Yeah, I think very normal at this stage. What they're often reverse cycling because they're very distracted feeders in the day. because the whole world has kind of like lit up for them and they don't really want to feed much in the day. I mean, it's fine if you're okay with that, but ideally, maybe you don't want to be only feeding overnight. So you really start sort of like pushing those daytime feeds, taking them into darker rooms and feeding, doing all the tricks for distracted feeding in the daytime. And usually they get back to it. So really want to get back to having a bulk of your calories in the daytime versus the night. This happens a lot also when parents go back to work, especially in Singapore. I know that happens a lot around that 4th month mark. And then, we'll often say that's okay, like give them a month or two. They just want that closeness and connection at night. They're feeding, and then you start trying to get them back to having majority of their calories in the day. I will say this at this point, that trying to get overall calorie intake in the day up helps sleep, but stuffing their tummies right before bed at night doesn't necessarily help them sleep better.
I see. Okay. Because yeah, that's a very common practice as well where I come from. It's adding, cereal powder and so on to the milk and feeding the baby. That's obviously also been debunked many, many times, and it's not a safe practice, but that is what they want to do. They want to fill their tummies and so on. And that it's good to see that there's evidence on saying that is not the way to go. Does a mother's consumption of coffee interfere with baby sleep? Any
I'm definitely not the expert there. I know that they give a recommended amount of caffeine, but not, I don't think so, right, Johanna? You'd be better to answer that question than me.
I would say that there are babies that are very sensitive and others that are not at all. So
Yeah.
it's about, observing your baby and seeing how they react. That's really the only thing you can do. There's no conclusive evidence on whether that affects them or not, because it's so individual. We are waking my 8-week-old to feed. She's sleeping and doesn't want to eat much at midnight. Should we just wait instead of waking her up? Dad gives her the bottle at midnight. During the day, she is breastfed.
If her output is great in the day and she's getting lots of pees and poos and she's feeding really well, yeah, then I would definitely not be waking her up and you could definitely get a bit more sleep. But I'd be keeping an eye on that and making sure she's gaining weight, she's got enough, sort of diaper output. Those are the two things that I'd be looking at this stage. And definitely post 3 months, if babies are feeding well in the daytime, I wouldn't be waking them up at night.
I,
Yeah.
if I can offer a different perspective, I've heard from an IBCLC and a GP to definitely wake every 3 hours in the first 3 months, and then they can go up to 4 hours every 3 months. Wake them up every 3 hours is what I wanted to say, in the first 3 months, and then in the night 4 hours, and that's really important for them to have that alertness in between. But that's just a different perspective, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I'll sort of defer to an IBCLC on this, right? Because sleep-wise, I know that a lot of baby sleep can consolidate at night at 6 to 8 weeks because that circadian rhythm starts to kick in. So I'm thinking that nature wouldn't have designed it that way, right? Like my logic is that if you're not using any additional things like the snoo or the swaddle and things like that, if you're not and they're still sleeping 6-hour stretches, they're likely just very ready for that. They're getting the calories that they need in the day. But again, I would be really mindful about like, what is their output? What additional support am I giving them at night? Like I'll often have parents telling me, oh, my baby naps 6-7 hours in the day, but they're contact napping the whole time.
Yeah.
So it's really about also looking at that holistic picture and seeing exactly, how we can help and making sure the baby's doing well and thriving.
Okay. My 10-month-old seems to have night separation anxiety. I'm with him all day and started safe bed sharing in the last 2 months, but he's still crying 3 times-ish a night and sometimes really difficult to resettle. Any advice will be appreciated.
So like even though they're bed sharing, the baby's waking and crying.
I don't know if that's the case. The mummy or daddy who asked that, if you are able to unmute yourself, please do. Okay, then we'll move on. How much sleep does it, sorry, or do you want to respond?
I do because I'm getting sort of like that, what I would like to know is that are they crying because their parents have like moved away, they're not in the bed, for example, right? Like sometimes we put babies to bed, we go out, we have dinner, they wake up in a panic. But sometimes it might be that they're just waking up in a panic and looking around and then they're okay once they see you, right? If they're crying beyond that, then I would want to dig into that, like what's going on, right? Do you then give them a feed and then they're still crying? So we want to look at like why that baby would be crying if they're crying for extended periods. If they're crying and they see you and you're like, oh, it's okay, and then they're like, oh, okay, you're here and I can go back to sleep, then of course that's fine.
Whole thing. Yeah. How much sleep does a 2-year-old need in a day? I'm currently at 10 hours a night and 2 in the afternoon, and it feels excessive for one of my twins.
It could very well likely be excessive. I'd have to pull up my chart and have a look, but some babies are just lower sleep needs. And I think, this mama's onto something there that, of course, when you have twins, it could be that one of your babies is very high. And actually, most often, I will see that one baby is actually low sleep needs and one is high. And I just looked it up. So, according to this is the National Sleep Foundation is where I'm getting the numbers from. It's 10 to 13 hours and 24 hours for this age. So you're right that 12 might be too high. They might just need about 11 for them to sleep better in that distribution. So they might just need an hour in the day and then 10 hours at night, or 2 hours in the day and 9 hours at night. So that adjustment and that rebalancing might need to happen. The interesting thing is that at the age of 2, there's almost an hour's drop in sleep needs as well. So they go from about 11 to 14 to 10 to 13 hours at that age.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Daytime naps. What is the best routine for a baby of 6 to 12 months? Do all naps have to be at home, or is it okay if baby naps in the stroller while we are outside?
Yeah. So 6 to 12 months is a very wide range. I would probably group around sort of 6 to 9 months and then 9 to 12 months. 6 to 9 months, most babies are still doing 3 naps in the day. You can absolutely do naps on the go. I'm a big proponent of all naps are good naps, right? Don't listen to the people who tell you that they have to be at home in that one environment and sleeping there. In fact, I think if your baby can nap anywhere, that's a huge gift, because then when you're traveling, when you need to be out, you'll know that they're going to take their nap instead of needing this very particular environment to be able to fall asleep. So, really like exposing them to the din of daily life, bright lights, and sound, those are all great things for the circadian clock. So I would say that for most babies between 6 to 9 months, they're doing about 3 naps a day. And then about that 8 to 10 month mark, they drop down to 2 naps a day. Usually about sort of 2 to 3 hours spread out over the day is how much I would say in terms of day sleep. And most babies at this age are needing about, I would say, I think it's about 11 to 14 hours for 9 months onwards, and sort of 12 to 15 hours on average for 6 to 9 months.
Okay, great. One mom is asking how to transition the longer sleep periods from morning to night. So I guess that is she means circadian rhythm. How can we move to more night sleeping rather than day sleeping? What are your recommendations for that?
So definitely in the newborn period, at least even the first 3 months, I would say all naps in bright daylight, no darkening of the room in the day. As soon as your baby wakes in the morning, get them outside. This is really, really key. We're lucky. We live in Singapore. The weather is mostly always nice. Get out of the house, get them into the pram, get them into carrier. It's great for you as well and your sleep. 15 to 20 minutes of the morning daylight is huge for our circadian clock. And then about an hour before bedtime is when we want to start dimming the lights, closing off those curtains, giving the body that cue that night is about to start, and then keeping the nights really dark, right? And if you need light to be able to change diapers or feed and things like that, we always suggest using red light because that doesn't inhibit sort of the development of the circadian rhythm. So really having those clear daytime and nighttime cues is what we want. As babies get older, and that sort of post fourth month period where getting them to nap in the day is harder because they're distracted and they want to look around, then yes, sure, you can go into a slightly darker room to get them to nap because they need that to be able to shut down and fall asleep. But you don't have to keep that room pitch black as often we hear sleep consultants saying. I definitely don't prescribe to that. Keeping that curtain a crack open even in the day is helpful.
Yeah. I think we are very lucky in a way in Singapore because sun sets quite early. So 7 to 7 is a great, it actually gets dark. Whereas when you're in Europe in the summer and it's light until 10 o'clock in the evening, that becomes a bit of a challenge to keep their regular sleeping cycles or patterns. My baby falls asleep on the breast at every feed. I keep waking him up every few seconds so that he can get a full feed. This means that each feed is almost an hour. What is your advice to avoid so much sleeping on the breast?
I would be talking to a lactation consultant for that, especially if your baby is very young. This is where meeting a lactation consultant just to make sure, you know, I know that there are different methods used, things like breast compression, but definitely not in my wheelhouse. But I
Yeah.
would say that if the concern is more that he's feeding for a long time, then meet the lactation consultant. But if they're just sleeping on you, they're not really feeding, that's totally fine. It's okay to be falling asleep on the breast if they've had a nice full feed, right? And they're getting that nice sort of milk drunk and then like falling asleep, then that's totally fine.
And sometimes it's a little bit difficult, especially at the beginning, to understand what is the baby actually doing at the breast. Are they actively sucking and taking in milk, or have they reached a stage where all they're doing is being comforted? There's nothing wrong with that at all. But the question is then, can we transition to a different position, for example, or when do we actually settle them down? If we take the baby off the breast and lay them down in their crib, for example, or hold them, and they wake up an hour later, we know that they haven't taken in enough. But if they're actually sleeping a longer stretch, then we can assume that, and the output is there as well, then we can actually assume that they've taken what they needed. Okay, one mom is asking, you talked about habit stacking while breastfeeding. Can you give some examples of other habits that could be done during breastfeeding?
Yeah, so things like, singing a lullaby or shushing or using little short sleep phrases, adding a physical cue like touch, so patting, stroking the baby's back or head while you're breastfeeding, right? You can introduce, if your baby's a bit older, you can introduce a little comfort object like a little soft blanket or a soft toy and pick that up every time you're feeding the baby. So the idea is that you have all these alternate cues that you could actually do when a baby's lying on a bed, for example, right? Some kind of a physical cue, some kind of a verbal cue that you're giving them that cue. As an option that you could even just use that lullaby instead of having to go to them at night to see first if they would resettle with that. So, and that's for older babies, of course. So it's really about just trying to find things that you find easy to do while you're breastfeeding. There's no like really clear directive on that. And then just, doing it every time you're sort of feeding in the daytime. And then you might find that one day you just tried that and it worked because the baby found it very comforting.
Mhm. Okay. What age do you stop night feeds cold turkey? My 2-year-old still asks for a bottle at night. Tips for stopping bottle feeds. I'm not sure that's your wheelhouse, as you say, but
I mean, you could stop at cold turkey. It's just not going to be much fun for everyone involved, I'm sure. At this age, it's more about like what kind of boundaries you want to have and consistently sticking to those boundaries. It's really not about anything else. And, we'll often talk about like having empathetic boundaries for children and saying, I know you really want that bottle, but I'm so sorry we're not having them anymore. And then it's a period of time of supporting them and giving them that space that they need to be like frustrated with you. And then they tend to just move on from it. But they're definitely not needing that if they're eating well in the day. So that's
yeah.
another thing to look at. Like, are they a picky eater, for example? Are they just needing that bottle to get back to sleep? So really looking at that and doing a deep dive into that could be helpful.
Yeah, so is it actually nutrition that they need, or is it the something that comforts them? And this could also, especially if that baby is not, you're maybe not tracking well in terms of weight gain, this could be a way to speak to a dietitian or a nutritionist to say, how can we, increase the calories throughout the day? How can we get them to eat meaningful meaningful meals that actually give them the calories that they need?
Yeah.
Okay. Opposite question. Our newborn loves to sleep. I was the same way. Slept 10 hours at 2 weeks per mom's old tales. And the bub went 6 hours at 2 weeks. She is happy and gaining weight above birth weight at 2 weeks. But our pediatrician says to continue as is. The internet, however, warns of letting young ones sleep too long. Should we be concerned about how much our 5-week-old loves her snoozes?
Yeah, I mean, I do get that because everyone's talking about how their babies are not sleeping, and there you have a baby. And like you'll always get the dagger looks from the parents when you're like, oh, my baby sleeps 8 hours at night. Like, oh no. But I think this is this is one of those moments where you as a parent know what's best for your family. So you take the evidence, you take the information that you get, you do that gut check, and you go, you know what? She's fine. Like, she's growing, she's thriving. I don't think I need to wake her up at night. And if anything changes, I'm right there and I can change that if I need to, right? But I think that, we have so much information bombarding us at all times, especially with social media, right? No one on Instagram is telling you sort of like, what all of their qualifications are all the time. Be careful about who you're following and who you're listening to. You want to make sure you're following the right people, making sure they have the right qualifications, that their philosophy is in line with what you believe as a parent. So really kind of like trying to drown out everything else and really tuning into what feels good for you. And if your doctor says that, I would be sort of trusting that.
Yeah, amazing. Um, Other than having a good routine, any other tips to promote longer sleep stretches at night?
Uh, Time. Like babies, as they grow, they will start consolidating night sleep. Usually, once they come out of that sort of fourth month sleep development that they go through, we will see some night consolidation happen again. Usually, the pattern is that we'll see a longer stretch at the start of the night and then sort of more frequent wakes towards the early morning. That's a very normal pattern for sleep development. But of course, we know that that first year doesn't look linear. It's a lot of ups and downs in terms of sleep development. And don't forget, sleep is the first thing that gets disrupted during developmental leaps as well, because the brain has to kind of reprogram itself to be like focusing on all these new skills and new things that it's learning, and sleep gets deprioritized. So, there's so many things that impact sleep in that sort of first year, especially even beyond that. Waiting it out often is the best approach, right? Like we don't always have to go in and fix it. Doing the easy things at easy times and doing the hard thing at easy times and the easy thing at hard times is what Lindsay Hookwe always says, right? Like, why do the hard things at hard times?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't have to do that. Like, wait for things to settle, wait for them to, uh, their sleep to settle down a bit, and then do the things that feel hard.
Okay. If a 9-month-old is sleeping 10 to 11 hours at night without waking up, but doesn't want to nap at all during the day, should we still push for the day naps? And any tips on how to get them to sleep or to nap?
Yeah, I would be still pushing at 9 months because if we look at sort of like what um, influences day sleep, it's what we call homeostatic sleep pressure. And ultimately, in the daytime, that's the only thing that's making babies to sleep, right? To go to sleep. So if they don't sleep, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a body override of that sleep pressure, which means that it'll kind of increase all those sort of like cortisol, adrenaline, all of those things that actually can impact sleep. right? So at 9 months, even if they just did two 30-minute naps in the day, that would be enough, right? If they don't need that much sleep and they're sleeping well at night, I would still be saying they would need 2 naps in a day.
Okay, and there's another thing about naps. My 5-month-old has only got 2 daytime naps at the moment, a total of 2 to 3 hours during the day. Is that okay, or do I have to manage to get her to sleep 3 times in a day?
Again, it's the same concept, right? Like if you think about sleep pressure and, sort of a tank of pressure, then that pressure is going to keep building and falling when you sleep. If you don't sleep when it's really high, the body is going to start overriding that sleep pressure, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not at all saying that overtiredness is evil, as often we hear, because we need some tiredness to be able to go to sleep, right? So like the 9-month-old, they may not just be feeling very tired. You might have to have longer wake windows for them. Similarly, if your baby's sleeping long stretches at one go, they may not be able to have 3 naps. I mean, at 5 months old, I would say if they were doing like 2 really solid chunks of naps and going to sleep quite early, it might even be okay. But again, with the case, like I'll always have to see and really do a deep dive into what the day is looking like to see what's working for that baby. Because every baby is so different, we really want to be able to identify what's best for them and their sort of sleep type, right? So it's really kind of doing that deep dive into what's working for them. But I always say, look, if they're looking happy, they're alert, they're not fussy or cranky most of the day, they're growing, developing, thriving, they're probably getting all the sleep that they need, right? It just might be about sort of redistributing that sleep a little bit just to make sure. If they're sleeping really well at night and just doing 2 30-minute naps in the day, that's fine too.
Yeah, okay. Then we talked about this question earlier, and the mom has just replied about falling asleep while breastfeeding. This is more a question for a lactation consultant, I would say, to make the feed more efficient and analyze what's really going on at the breast. Maybe he's having a hard time sucking the milk out and transferring the milk. Maybe we can have help with different positions, and maybe we can find different strategies to keep that baby awake as well. How to stop a baby contact napping during the day. Sleeping in a cot independently at night. He has always been in a cot. I'm finding myself climbing into the cot and to do the earlier,
I mean, that is the sort of limitation of a cot. It's really hard often, to transfer them in, which is why we'll kind of then start talking about that. If you want your baby to sleep in a cot, then we start working on them falling asleep in the cot, right?
Yeah.
So not falling asleep in your arms, but maybe you've done the habit stacking, you've created all those cues, you put them in a little bit awake, you're sitting down by the side of the cot, and then you're giving them a lot of support to fall asleep there versus having to fall asleep in arms and then transferring them in, right? But of course, it's not uncommon to have parents who will be contact napping through the day and the baby sleeping in the cot overnight, and that works too. If a parent wants to move away from that contact napping in the day, I usually suggest to start with 1 nap. So start with 1 nap where you're moving away from the contact napping, and it's okay if that nap is short because it is likely going to be a short nap. So pick a nap in the day, usually like the last nap. We don't care if that nap is short. Pick that nap and put them in the cot at that time, right? And see how that goes. And then you can add another nap on, right? I often will say, like, the naps that they're going to be dropping, just don't worry about those. Just do whatever works for those naps, right? So it is really varied. But again, like if they're sleeping in the cot at night and they like contact napping in the day, that's fine too.
Okay.
I will see some parents just getting into the cot and feeding and then climbing out. If you're nimble enough to do that, that works, right? Like you can absolutely do that.
All right. A question. So we only have 5 minutes left. Mummies or daddies, please ask your questions now. We don't have time for a lot now. But the last question that I can see at the moment is what brings me to the next, which is resources. So this mom is asking for resources for sleep schedule recommendations, like how many naps during each developmental phase, or any books that you recommend with practical tips for good sleeping practices. And I think you've mentioned previously, maybe we can ask them list them as well, the different websites that people can consult, and then maybe books that you really like, or even
Yeah,
it's actually.
I think maybe I could send you that list, Johanna. Like I have a bunch of resources that I always send parents, so I can send you that. And in terms of like that sort of like developmental phases and how many naps, I always would go to I don't know if you guys follow, but Lindsay Hookway on Instagram. Her Instagram account is amazing. I learn stuff there, every day.
Yeah.
And she's an IBCLC and also the creator of the holistic sleep coaching program. She on her Instagram has a post about like how much sort of daytime sleep by age for lower sleep needs for average babies and for high sleep needs babies. And that's also really important to take into account, right? Like on average, how much sleep are babies getting? In terms of books, I love Sarah Goldsmith's book.
Mm-hmm.
It's
What's
just,
the
what is it called? Gentle Sleep Book, I think.
dental
Uh,
sleep?
I love Lindsay Hookway's book. Let's talk about the baby's first year sleep. I think it's called, I'm giving you all the wrong names, so I will have to look those up and give you the right ones.
Look at this
Um,
under the YouTube as well, and then moms can look it up there. I think that's a
yeah,
really
sure. I'll send you that list.
okay.
Um,
That
and my thoughts on Gina Ford, ditch it.
never had children. Can you
Gina
believe?
Ford never had children. Gina Ford was written before demand feeding became the gold standard, right? Because she used to even talk about scheduling feeds. Look, again, like there's no one size fits all when it comes to books. If you read it, you like the idea, you try it out, it works, great. If it doesn't, there's nothing wrong with you or your baby. It's just that it didn't work for you, right? And I think that's really important for us to know because a lot of us are following things like sleep programs, what is it called, taking care of babies and things like that. The main idea is to remember that every baby is different. There are some things that'll work for your baby and there are some things that will not. And if they don't work, it's not a failure on your part or your baby's part.
Okay. One question left. How long should be a nap at 6 months for 3 naps a day? Should we wake up the baby after 1.5 hours? Or should we let him sleep as maybe he wants to now transition to only 2 sleeps a day?
Again, I would need to have a sort of deeper look at the schedule and see what's working for this baby. But I mean, you could let them sleep and see how long they go, right? They might just wake up at the 2 hour mark, which would still be okay. Some parents are happy to just go really purely baby led. And if you are going baby led, then you just really let them do whatever they're doing,
Yeah.
right? But if you feel like you're someone who does need a little bit more predictability and schedule, then it's okay to wake up a baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with waking up your baby.
Okay.
And I'll often talk about this in terms of like start times for the day. Like if you have a baby who's waking, and I'm not talking about early infancy, like maybe 0 to 6, 8 weeks is fine. But after that, once their circadian clock is starting to develop, having, about an hour time band in the morning when they're waking up, 7 to 8.
Yeah.
That's their wake up time. And if they're still waking at 8, it's okay to wake them up in the morning.
Okay. And obviously, this is super individual because we all have different schedules as well. And your baby needs to basically eventually fit your schedule as well and not completely disrupt the family's sleep or whatever they do. Do you know a book called Precious Little Sleep by Alex Dubiel? Yeah.
No, I've never read that one. I might have heard about it, but I'm not quite sure what I heard.
Yeah.
So I'll look it up and let you know if someone said that it was good or not good.
Would be nice. I'm writing down the mummy's name so we can reply to her later. And then the resources we will share. Is it okay also if I share your top 10 tips for newborn sleep? which I think is a really good overview of what to expect in the newborn phase. And we share that in all our antenatal classes as well when we talk about this. But for any mummies wanting that or daddies wanting that, please PM me and I'll send you the PDF if that's okay with you, Anahita.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. That is amazing. So just to wrap up, basically, Anahita, you are available for individual sleep coaching. I know that you're very busy, but if moms do want to engage you, can you quickly say how you work with them?
Sure. I have a website that has like different packages. Most of my packages are very sort of like basic, where it's just like an hour long Zoom consult, and then you can pick and choose how much follow-up support you want. I did recently add on my platinum package, which is like the whole hog package. If people feel like they need a lot of hand holding, then that's what I offer, because people were asking and I didn't have anything. So you can just go to my website. It's anahitabhatia.com. Have a look at what's available. My approach is very clearly stated there. So again, like I'll always tell parents, make sure we're aligned, right? Like I'm saying things that work for you and feel good for you before you decide you want to work with me. I do offer a free 20-minute discovery chat that can be scheduled on my website as well. So, we can have that call, see, how you're feeling about the kind of support that I offer. And then, of course, you can sign up on my website.
Amazing. And we'll share all the details in a minute as well. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. I don't know if you're all ramped up now and unable to sleep, or if you can get a little nap in as well.
No, I'm ramped up now. I'm awake. My brain is working, so that's good. I hope it sounded like my brain is working.
You're amazing as always. Thank you so much for joining us. We had almost 50 mums on the call, so that was a really great turnout. And thank you, mummies, for spending your morning with me and with us. And we'll see you again next Wednesday for our next chat. Okay. Thank you, and have a lovely day, all of you. Bye.